This eclipse, it's going to also be a really unique one because the sun has been crazy active recently. One thing I find really cool about eclipses is that every time you see something different. And this is partly because the sun goes through a cycle where every about roughly 11 years, there's a period of maximum activity and a period of minimum activity. And this is really because of the way that the sun's magnetic field is changing and evolving, and it goes through periods where it's very dormant and then periods where it's very active. And so as you see along the period of different amounts of activity, the corona looks very different. So the magnetic field totally changes, the density changes, whether or not you have coronal mass ejections or what they look like, and the different sorts of structures you see, like do you see these open field lines that kind of radiate outward, or do you see more of these streamer kind of things that come to like a tip and they're a little more dense? And so because of this, every single eclipse is different. Every corona that you see is different, or really it's the same corona, but every time you see the corona, it's so different. So I'm really excited to see this one because it'll be the closest to solar maximum that I've seen. So anyway, but this eclipse, it's going to also be a really unique one because the sun has been crazy active recently. Like I've just been seeing things, articles and stuff saying that the sun is popping off coronal mass ejections like crazy right now. So I'm really hoping that we see a beautiful eruption during the eclipse, and and because it's going to be a longer eclipse, it's going to be a bit darker. So combine the fact that the sun is active with a really dark eclipse, and it's also very high in the sky. So I think, like, from an observing perspective, I don't think I've had a better eclipse. So I'm really looking forward to this one.
Will there always be eclipses?
That's a very good question. So basically, the moon is actually getting farther away from us over time. And this is because as the moon orbits the Earth, it actually creates the tides, right? That's why we have the high and the low tide every day, or twice a day. And that the tides actually kind of rub on the Earth, and there's some friction there. And that actually applies a torque to the Earth-Moon system. And so it actually slowly flings the moon away from us. I won't go into all the physics of it, but basically the moon is, because of the tides, is slowly drifting away. And so if you wait a long period of time, eventually the moon will be too far away where all of the eclipses, it won't be able to fully block the sun anymore. Now, if you run the clock backwards and say what was happening when the dinosaurs were around hundreds of millions of years ago, the moon was quite a bit closer. And so actually you would have had total solar eclipses that would last much longer and would have occurred much more often. So the dinosaurs were probably treated to, a few times a year that they would see a total solar eclipse, and it might last, many, many minutes, as opposed to now where we're, getting just a couple of minutes. And sometimes, like what happened last year across the US, there was an eclipse, but the moon was a little bit too far away, and so you had what we call an annular eclipse, where you get the ring of fire effect. Part of the problem is that the moon's orbit is tipped about 5 degrees relative to the Earth's orbit around the sun. So there's certain times of year where the moon and the sun and the Earth line up perfectly, and there's other times of year where the moon passes above or below the sun. But certainly we are super lucky that we have a moon that is as big as it is, which is much, much bigger than any moon of any other planet that we know of, relative. So the relative size of the Earth and the moon they're far closer in size than any other planet-moon system that we've discovered. So it's probably a cosmic fluke that we have this coincidental alignment. And I've actually heard, jokes where people say, in the far future, if humans really do colonize the galaxy and spread out to different solar systems, then eventually there'll be tourism to come back to the Earth to see an eclipse, because it will be something that they won't have on any of the other solar systems.
Is this a rare type of eclipse? Like in terms of the overall type, or is there an even rarer one that, like, this one only happens every whatever?
So this one is long, at 4.5 minutes, it's a bit long. The theoretical maximum, though, is over 7 minutes. And actually, that's a side note I wanted to make, which is that a lot of people tell me, and it really frustrates me when they say, oh, like here in Boston, for example, we're going to have a 93% eclipse. Like, isn't that good enough? It's 93% is good, right? And I'm like, no, absolutely not. It is completely different, because you don't see the corona. You will see a really cool thing, which is the crescent sun, and it's still a great experience, and I'm still, handing out these glasses and telling people, safely observe the partial eclipse. It's a great experience. But that said, if you can go see a total eclipse, that's a whole nother ballgame. That's seeing the corona. That's really fully experiencing it. A metaphor I like to use for this is if you went through a connection in the Denver airport and then you told all your friends about the time you visited Denver, they would say, no, you didn't. You went through the airport. Like, that's a partial eclipse compared to a total eclipse. Like, the total eclipse is going out in the city and seeing everything there is to see, whereas the partial eclipse is like, well, yeah, I had a connection.
But okay, so the corona, so you can study the corona, but why is the corona special?
It's really just one step along the way of how the sun is influencing basically the entire solar system. So, inside the sun, you've got nuclear fusion powering it, and then you've got these different layers in the sun. Eventually you get to the surface, and that's what we can see normally. So there's tons of telescopes that observe the surface of the sun all the time. But then right above the surface, you have the corona, and it's much lower density than the surface, which is why it's so much fainter. And then that material actually is unbounded. So unlike the surface of the sun where it kind of just stays there, the corona actually expands out into space and fills the entire solar system. So if, from a sort of a selfish motivation, we're interested in understanding the corona because any dynamics that happen in the corona will propagate outward and potentially can impact the Earth, other planets, if we have spacecraft, or even if, in the future we want to go to Mars or something. This is the sort of thing we have to think about of like, how is the sun impacting the solar system? And the corona is really this sort of nexus point where a lot of that stuff gets started. And so if you really want to understand how to predict what the sun is going to be doing to the rest of the solar system, you really need to understand the corona. But because we have that trick where it's difficult to observe the corona normally, we don't know that much about it because it's so hard to observe. And so it's sort of simultaneously this really important region for understanding how the solar wind is going to be formed and how the sun is impacting the solar system, but also it's one of the most difficult places to observe. So it's this combination of like, it's very important and it's very difficult to do that make it such an important thing to study.
How does this translate to me sitting in my house in Seattle?
With this sort of data, we can figure out things like temperature and density and other physical properties of the corona. And so basically with these different sorts of data, we can infer a lot of the physical properties of the corona, right? And then the thing is, okay, that is then an observation of what the corona was actually doing at some particular time. So in the long term, we figure out how we can improve our models, which then ultimately will improve our prediction ability so that we can tell you, is there going to be a solar event that is going to be a problem for us here on the Earth? But even more fundamentally, from just a pure science perspective, this sort of thing gives us a better understanding of the complex physics that's going on in the corona, and that could have other applications. Often in science, we work on things that don't necessarily have an obvious, immediate return to the economy or something. But then maybe a century later, someone realizes, all this work that they did does have a huge impact. And you can think back to the people working on the early electricity experiments in the 19th century and stuff. They weren't thinking necessarily about how this is going to be powering all of our society. Yeah. But ultimately, specifically with the corona, it's can we predict not only when these sort of, especially the eruptive events like coronal mass ejections, when they're forming, how they're being initiated, but then also once they've started being initiated, how are they going to evolve and propagate through the corona? And that will have an impact, on where it ends up going, how strong it ends up being, things like this.